All right, so today we're diving into something I'm sure everyone listening has dealt with at some point, calling in sick to work.
Oh, yeah, definitely a universal experience, right?
Absolutely. And we got a ton of requests from you guys to unpack this topic, and you sent in some really interesting material from English Pod, a dialogue and vocabulary lesson. And it really digs into the nuances of this seemingly simple interaction.
I think what makes it so fascinating is that it goes beyond just like the basic phrases you might need and gets into the subtle communication dynamics at play. Like, how do you convey that you're genuinely sick without overdoing it? How do you navigate those unspoken expectations around calling out, especially in different cultures? It's a lot more layered than you might initially think.
Yeah, it's not just about saying, I'm sick, I can't come in. There's a whole art to it, right?
Exactly. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today. So we've got these excerpts from English Pod featuring this conversation between an employee, Julie, and her boss, Daniel. It's all about Julie calling in sick, and it's really interesting to analyze.
Yeah, and we also have Marco and Amir, the hosts of English Pod, offering their take on the whole exchange and highlighting some really useful vocabulary.
So it's like we get multiple layers of analysis, right? We're looking at the dialogue itself, and then we're also getting these expert insights from Marco and Amir about what the language choices reveal.
Exactly. So let's dive right in. In this first call, Julie lists her symptoms. She's got a headache, sore throat, runny nose, slight fever, and she uses that classic line coming down with the flu. Marco from English Pod pointed out that Daniel, the boss, didn't sound totally convinced. What are your thoughts on that initial part of the dialogue?
It's interesting because on the surface, Daniel's response is perfectly professional, but there's just this slight hesitation, this lack of immediate warmth or concern. Like he's processing it, but not fully buying it yet. And I think this is where those subtle cues and vocal tone come into play. It's like you can almost hear that skepticism creeping in, even if it's unintentional.
It's like he's thinking, okay, sure, we'll see how this plays out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he needs a bit more convincing.
Right.
And this really highlights how, even in a professional setting, those unspoken communication signals can be just as important as the words themselves.
For sure. And then we get into some key vocabulary. The first one they highlight is, I'm feeling quite ill today. It's a pretty straightforward way to say you're not well, but that use of quite seems to add a little extra emphasis.
Oh, absolutely. Quite ill takes it up a notch. It's not just a mild feeling of being under the weather. It's like, this is serious. I'm really not well.
Right, and it's almost like she's preemptively addressing any doubts Daniel might have about the severity of her illness.
Exactly. It's like she's adding that extra layer of justification for why she needs to stay home. And then there's the phrase, I'm coming down with the flu.
This one's interesting because it implies an illness that's developing, like it's gonna get worse.
Yeah, it's almost like a preemptive explanation, right? Like, I'm calling you now, but it's only going to go downhill from here. Precisely. And that ties into this idea of managing expectations, like letting your boss know that this isn't just a fleeting thing, this is the start of something more significant. And then, of course, there's the very common phrase, calling in sick, which I think Amir points out is so efficient. It's immediately understood in a work context.
Yeah, it's like workplace shorthand. It cuts
Ah,
to the chase and tells your boss exactly why you're calling.
exactly. No need for lengthy explanations. Everyone knows what it means. But then we get to that last phrase from this first call, the one that really sparked a lot of discussion. I was hoping to take the day off. Marco and Amir really emphasize how much more polite this is compared to just saying something like, I can't come in today.
Yeah, and I think they're onto something there. That subtle difference really highlights the importance of maintaining that professional courtesy, even when you're not feeling well. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it speaks volumes about understanding workplace dynamics. I was hoping to take the day off, frames it as a request, acknowledging that ultimately the boss has the final say. It shows deference to that hierarchy.
Absolutely. It's like you're acknowledging the potential impact on the team and asking for understanding rather than just stating a fact. Now, let's move on to that second dialogue where both Marco and Amir felt that Daniel, the boss, actually believed Julie this time. What shifts did you notice, either in Julie's tone or Daniel's response, that signaled that change?
For me, the most telling shift is in Daniel's closing remark. He says, okay, then, try and get some rest. And there's a genuine sense of concern there. Like he's gone from skeptical to actually caring about her well being.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to that initial I see from the first call, which felt a bit more detached, almost like he was just taking notes.
Exactly. And while we don't have details about Julie's tone from the material, Marco and Amir's consensus implies she probably sounded more genuinely unwell this time around.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some vocal fatigue, congestion, something that added that extra layer of authenticity.
Right, like her voice was doing the convincing for her.
Exactly. It really underscores how much we communicate through those subtle vocal cues.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We're constantly sending and receiving these signals, even when we're not consciously aware of it. And this actually reminded me of Amir's anecdote about almost calling in sick himself. He shared that he had similar symptoms to Julie, the headaches, sore throat, runny nose, but no fever. It really highlights that common dilemma of, am I sick enough to stay home?
Oh, yeah, I think we've all been there. It's like weighing the severity of your symptoms against the potential disruption of missing work. Is it a power through it situation or a legitimate need for a sick day?
Exactly. And then Amir brings in this really interesting cultural observation about calling in sick in Egypt. He mentioned that it's not uncommon for someone else to actually make the call on behalf of the sick person. The reasoning, he speculates, is that if you're well enough to get to the phone, then you're well enough to go to work.
That's wild, isn't it? It's such a different mindset from what many Western workplaces are used to.
Yeah, it really highlights how deeply ingrained these cultural norms are when it comes to work ethic and perceptions of illness. And it makes you wonder about the underlying assumptions at play. Is it a lack of trust in the employee's self-assessment of their health? Or is it more about this cultural emphasis on resilience and showing up no matter what?
I think it's probably a combination of factors, right? It's like a whole web of cultural values and expectations shaping these seemingly mundane interactions. It really gets you thinking about the diversity of perspectives on this, something as simple as calling in sick.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder that what might be considered normal in one culture can be completely different in another. Now, let's circle back to some of the key vocabulary that English Pod highlights. They provide these really clear definitions and examples that I think are super helpful for solidifying our understanding. We've already touched on some of them, but it's worth revisiting.
Yeah, definitely. So how may I help you? It's that classic polite opening you hear in pretty much any professional phone interaction. It sets the tone for a courteous exchange. And then we have quite ill, which, as we discussed, means very sick. And they give a great example. I'm feeling quite ill today, which is exactly how Julie used it.
Right, it's like that extra layer of emphasis. And then coming down, meaning getting or acquiring, as in coming down with the flu, it really emphasizes that you're in the early stages of contracting an illness.
Exactly. And it also suggests that it's likely to get worse, which again is part of managing your boss's expectations. And of course, we have calling in sick, which is defined as report that you will not go to work because you are sick. I mean, that's the whole point of this conversation,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. And then there's was hoping, meaning to kindly expect. And the example they give, I was hoping to take the day off, really reinforces that element of polite request rather than a demand.
Yes, exactly. Showing deference to the boss's authority. And then they also contrast this with impolite, which is, of course, the opposite of polite. And this really highlights why Julie's initial thought of being more direct might not have been the best approach.
Right, because in a professional setting, politeness is key. And then we have day off because you're sick or simply sick day, both referring to taking time off work due to illness. Those are pretty standard terms in any workplace vocabulary.
Absolutely. And then make it into work, meaning to be capable of going to work. So saying you can't make it into work clearly communicates your inability to be physically present.
It's that simple but effective phrasing. Now, the review also touches on some additional vocabulary like assign, indication, symptom, allow, and permission. While these weren't used in Julie's initial call, they're definitely words that come up in the broader context of calling in sick.
Exactly. Like if colleagues need to be assigned Julie's tasks because she's out sick, or her symptoms being the indication of her illness, and of course needing her boss to allow her to take the day off, effectively granting permission for her absence.
Right. It's all about those interconnected aspects of calling in sick, how it impacts the team, the procedures for getting approval, the language we use to describe our condition. I think that faster repetition they do at the end of the vocabulary review is a really clever way to help listeners remember those terms.
Oh, absolutely. Repetition is key when it comes to language learning. It helps those words stick in your memory.
So to sum it all up, we've gone beyond just the basic phrases for calling in sick. We've explored those subtle cues in communication, the impact of tone of voice, and even those fascinating cultural differences in how this whole interaction is approached. Hopefully you guys listening now have a much deeper understanding of this seemingly routine but surprisingly complex situation.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is that even something as simple as calling in sick is governed by all these unspoken rules and expectations, influenced by both workplace culture and broader societal norms. It's a reminder that communication is so much more than just the words we say. It's about understanding the context, the power dynamics, the cultural nuances that shape every interaction.
And that brings us to our final thought for you all. What are the unspoken rules and expectations around calling in sick in your own workplace or culture? How do those norms differ from maybe what we've discussed today? And what do those differences reveal about the underlying values and attitudes towards work, health, and communication in your own context? It's definitely something to ponder, especially the next time you or someone you know needs to navigate this whole calling in sick situation.
Yeah, it's something to be mindful of. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
Bye. Bye.